Dream, Play, Build, Hands-on Community Engagement for Enduring Spaces and Places, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the U.S. EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The website provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association and 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Dream, Play, Build, Hands-on Community Engagement for Enduring Spaces and Places. You can also search for event number 9230541. I'd like to acknowledge our webinar partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So our speakers today are James Rojas and John Kamp. James Rojas is an urban planner, community activist, educator, and artist who runs the planning, model building, and community outreach practice PlaceIt. Through PlaceIt, he has developed an interdisciplinary community healing, visioning, and outreach process that uses storytelling, objects, art production, and play to help improve the urban planning outreach process. James is an international expert in public engagement and has facilitated more than 500 workshops and built more than 100 interactive models across the US, Mexico, Canada, Europe, and South America. His expertise includes model building as a means of community and planning outreach, working with underserved, disadvantaged communities and bringing overlooked voices to the planning discussion, making the physical form of cities relevant to broad audiences, and understanding how immigrants, especially Latino immigrants, see and understand urban and suburban space in the US and why they oftentimes reshape those forms in the ways that they do. He has a Master's of City Planning and a Master's of Science in Architecture Studies from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a Bachelor of Science in Interior Design from Woodbury University. John Kamp is an urban and landscape designer, facilitator, and licensed landscape contractor. Through his design practice, Prairie Form, he has more than a decade of experience in the design and installation of irrigation-free landscapes, the writing and illustrating of design guidelines, including the small lot design guidelines for the city of Los Angeles, and work in urban tree canopy restoration and improving neighborhood walkability. He is an experienced facilitator who leads workshops through PlaceIt, has conducted trainings on water conservation and irrigation-free landscaping, and has worked extensively with immigrant youth in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has a Master's of Urban Planning and Urban Design from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University. Following their presentation, James and John will answer as many questions as time permits. As always, you can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. With that, we're going to get started with a quick poll, as we often do, in fact, always at this point. One question today: where do you live and or work? And the options there: West, Midwest, South, Mid-Atlantic, Northeast, or International. Just to let everybody see where we're from today, and also to let the panelists know as well. So if you're having any trouble responding to that, you may need to exit the full screen mode, and we'll give you all a couple more seconds to respond before we close this and turn it over to our speakers today. And thanks everybody for joining us. Just a couple more seconds to close it up. And as usual, we're very diverse geographically today. So 29% of our audience says that they are in Mid-Atlantic Northeast, 24% in the West, 22% in the South, 18% Midwest, and 6% of our audience today is outside the United States. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John to get started. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having us. I'm going to pull up the slideshow and we will get started. So yeah, like Michael said, we're going to be talking about the book that just came out that we just wrote called Dream, Play, Build. And I'll have the slide at the end as well, but if you, by the end of this or in the middle of it or whenever you'd like to buy the book, we do have a discount code here for 30%. So that's down at the bottom here. So you can just buy it off the Island Press website directly and use the code SMART and you'll get 30% off the book. I also wanted to thank Smart Growth Online for inviting us. I started Prairie Farm in my parents' basement. James started Place It in his mom's house. When we started like 15 years ago, basically we were doing the work for, it sometimes felt like it was just for ourselves. So it's really exciting and great to be at a space like this and reaching out to and connecting with so many people. Okay, so these are, as Michael said, Place It and Prairie Farm. So James, I just wanted to talk briefly about Place It.
Yeah, so I designed Place It as a way to help Latinos communicate on urban planning issues, to tell their story about urban planning for plans and developments.
And I started Prairie Farm in 2008. I had been working as a city planner and urban designer for the city of Los Angeles, and really wanted to do something that was more connected to the natural world. And so that's what led me to starting Prairie Farm. And back then it was a much more top-down process where I did everything from the design to the installation. And now as it's evolved, it's become something that's much more about engaging everyone through their hands and their senses in the exploration and design of landscapes and urban spaces and places. So just an overview about what we're going to talk about. We'll go a little bit more in depth into how we came up with the methods that we're going to talk about today and the methods that we talk about in the book. We're going to talk about the psychology of working with your hands and senses. This is really the foundation of everything that we do. And I think that if we go through that, it will make more sense as to why we use the methods that we do and why we keep coming up with new methods that are grounded in working with your hands and senses for engaging diverse audiences in urban planning and landscape and transportation. And then we'll talk about a few projects that we've worked on, so the applications for these methods. And then finally, we'll talk about outcomes a little bit. So a lot of times we get questions about, though people will say, well, that's cool, you do these things like what you see in the photo here, but how does that actually lead to tangible outcomes, plans, designs, drawings? But while we're there, we're going to want to talk about all the really important intangible outcomes that come out of this process. And then we'll have a Q&A. So you'll notice that we're not going to just go point by point through the book. It's just not, I don't think it would be interesting for you as an audience. And in this way, like, you'll get a little taste of what we do, and ideally you'll want to learn more, and maybe more ideally you'll want to buy the book. So just a little bit of background about us, about how we got involved in doing the kind of community engagement that we do. I'll turn it over to James and he can talk first, and then I will.
Yeah, back in the early 2000s, I was working for LA Metro on the East LA light rail line corridor study, and we were going to a Latino neighborhood, and we would have meetings with Latinos, maybe 50 in a room, and all they would do would kind of nod their head yes or no. But I had just written my thesis on Latino urbanism. I knew that this community had a lot of great ideas. So how would I pull them? How would I pull the ideas out of them? So at the same time, I opened up an art gallery in downtown Los Angeles, started working with many Chicano artists, and was amazed how these artists could engage community members through their senses and aspirations and feelings through their artwork, which is very much about the senses, photography, sculpture and painting. So I thought, why can't I, as a city planner, become an artist and really help people engage in cities through these creative processes? And that's when I started, using the objects and bringing them to meetings and having people start to build their hands to talk about these really kind of sensory-based ideas about space. So this whole process started out of the art world, and that gave me a way to really kind of test it out and really kind of refine the method. And since then, we've done over 1,000 workshops all across the U.S. and abroad.
And like I said, I've been working as a city planner and urban designer for the city of Los Angeles. So I've been on the inside within bureaucracy, within government, and had really seen and experienced firsthand kind of the horrors of community engagement, how it was done to basically just tick off a box, but also how the meetings themselves would usually devolve into something that was some variation of kind of a catastrophe. And so by the end of that experience, I really thought, oh, community engagement just isn't worthwhile at all. It's not helpful. It's not useful. Then when James and I started doing this work, and this is the two of us, our younger selves, in downtown Los Angeles, that was very different back then. We started doing this, and we talk about this actually in the book in the intros about how this kind of emerged and evolved into something that we use today as a community engagement tool. But this is really where I started to see, okay, there could be a different way of doing community engagement that could work. And so community engagement isn't useless after all. So the psychology of engaging people through their hands and senses. Let's talk about this because this is really important. And we go more in depth into this in the book, but I want to give you an overview of this so that what we talk about later makes more sense. So the talking brain, and the reason why I bring up the talking brain is because that is typically what is fired up in a typical community engagement setting or a public meeting setting. You're asked to say what you think about something, either respond to, say, like 3 options that a planning department brings to you, or you have 2 minutes to just say what you think. And that part of your brain is, loosely speaking, the prefrontal cortex. And this is really the part of our brains that keeps us focused on the here and now, on what we perceive as needs for survival. So I say perceive because sometimes those things are not necessarily what we need for survival, but they're what we perceive that we need to survive in that moment. And so what happens when we engage people through talking, we're really firing up that part of people's brains and the survival focused, selfish part of our brains. And this is a big reason why, and we all know this, if we've been to community meetings either as a member of the public or as someone who works for a city, the meetings tend to be really negative. People largely focus on the negatives. Sorry, we have a phone call, an answering machine in the background. Okay, I think we're good here. So what happens when people when people are engaged through just talking, they tend to focus on very basic things, and these are things that we hear all the time and are very familiar, I think, to a lot of people who've been to community meetings. People say they want more parking, they want like the photo right here in the slide. Or they say they want less traffic, so their ideal community is something that looks like this, where they just have this massive freeway and no cars in it. Or they say they don't want any density. What happens is that talking-based communication gives us a sense that people, these are the concerns that people have. These are the values that people have. They just want more parking, they want less traffic, and they just don't want any more housing. The other thing that happens when we engage people just through talking is that it really favors people who are okay with speaking in front of people and okay with conflict. Most of us are actually not comfortable with public speaking, and this is totally normal and natural. And actually, you can link this back to when we were hunter-gatherers. And essentially, if something was staring at you, that meant that they or it wanted to eat you or kill you, basically. And so when you bring fast forward to now, when you're standing in front of a room and everyone is staring at you, it makes us on a very fundamental psychological, physiological level uncomfortable. And it's really connected back to that. But there are exceptions. So there are people like the guy in this picture here who clearly has no qualms about standing up in front of his neighbors and friends and maybe enemies and speaking his mind. But this is a very particular kind of person, and this isn't everyone. So what ends up happening is that these are the kinds of people who speak, and then no one else talks. And then that further skews the outcomes, because then you think, well, this guy spoke, these folks spoke, so they had opinions, whereas no one else had anything to say because they don't care. So what we try to do is get people out of this survival mode so that they can be expansive and creative with their thinking. So this is why we engage people through their hands and senses, because you're going to get people out of that survival mode and suddenly they can be creative and not be so focused on the here and now. So you fire up a completely different part of your brain, and then you can sink into a state of play, and then you can be aspirational and collaborative. And this is really key here. Because when we just engage people through talking, it's actually really hard for people to be collaborative as well. People tend to kind of shoot down other people's ideas. But we work with our hands and senses. It's actually a very natural, normal space for us to be in for being collaborative. And we don't have the same kinds of impulses where we try to sort of push people's ideas out of the way. We can make space for everyone's ideas and discuss them and collaborate in a really productive way. And then the other thing too is that we can tap into our core values. So we can transcend these kind of very basic things that people come up with when you ask them what they care about. So, they say they want more parking and less traffic, but then when we have people work with their hands, they actually tap into the things that really matter to them. Nature, family, friends, exploration, discovery. They never end up talking about parking and less traffic and no density. And we put this slide in too, so we think it's really important. So it's equity without saying equity. A lot of attempts at equity these days center around language. And for us, what we do is embed equity into the process itself. So the very nature of this process, because it's accessible, because it's hands-on, because it doesn't require you to have a background in design or planning, you don't have to have a perfect grasp of English to engage in these methods. It just by default levels the playing field. And so we don't ask people to use a certain set of language when they are a part of these workshops at all. There aren't ground rules that we set. The nature of these activities just automatically by default makes it and sets up a situation in which people can be collaborative and positive and aspirational and work together. So the next part is where we're going to talk about some sample projects that we worked on. So you can see how we apply these methods to practical planning, urban design, transportation projects. So this is this is a California bike ped underpass, California Avenue bike ped underpass. This is in Palo Alto, and we were brought in to generate creative solutions to a shared bike ped space where there had actually been a lot of conflicts. So this is one of the residents, bicyclists. About 50% or over 50% of students bike to school in Palo Alto now. The bike ped underpass was built in the 60s when it was basically assumed that you would just bike here and there, but it wouldn't be something that you would do as a means of transportation. So it's very narrow, and there have actually been a lot of conflicts, or had been a lot of conflicts, not physical conflicts, but more so just tension and anger between bicyclists using the space and pedestrians using the space. So we were brought in to try to find some common ground and generate some creative solutions. So what we did is we held 2 model building workshops. First, one with the younger users of the space who tended to be those who bike through the space, not completely, but that tended to be how it broke down. And then we held another workshop with older users of the space. The model building prompts that we used weren't specific to the underpass, so we had them build their first memory of a mobility experience, and then we had them work in teams to build their ideal shared bike ped space. But we didn't have them engage directly around the underpass itself. Then on a later date, we brought both groups together to the actual site. We started by going over the recurring themes from the previous workshops to show everyone that there was really a lot of common ground and a lot of shared values, despite the fact that people maybe before this hadn't seen eye to eye. Then we brought them into the space itself. And so one of the things we do is we have people explore spaces and places with their senses. So this is what we did here. They went into the underpass and we had them, just gave them the simple prompt of finding a place in the underpass that they liked, hanging out there for a little bit, and then we went to each person and they talked about why they liked that space. Then finally, we brought people together into mixed groups of older users of the space and younger, and they worked together to build their ideal underpass. And it was pretty incredible. There wasn't any conflict. It was just collaboration, and people generated some really amazing creative ideas for the space. And the planners there actually couldn't believe that everyone was able to work together because it had been so contentious before, and the public meetings had really devolved into shouting matches. And here we actually got people together and they could finally collaborate. I'm going to pass it over to James, and he's going to talk about this next project.
Yeah, in 2000, I think 13 or 14, I was down in Phoenix, and I was called to do a workshop for the Disability Center because they had just built this beautiful facility for people with disabilities in Phoenix, Arizona. And right across the street is a light rail line, but there was no light rail stop for the center. So the people had to walk a mile in the direction to get there, and under the Phoenix sun, it's really kind of difficult and problematic. So we held a workshop at the center where we asked people to build their ideal station based on their disability, their struggle. How would you solve that problem? So what they did, they actually built stations, that really solved their problems, and then they shared them with each other, and they built together their ideal stations, each team, each table, and they found power in these models because now they were able to look at their struggle, their struggle, and find a solution for it that was very tangible and wrote to the model. So for the next couple of years, they lobbied the mayor of Phoenix and the Valley Transit Authority to build them a station. And today they got a station. They had a station built there that was kind of based on a lot of their ideas that came out of the workshop, such as shade, flowers, water, sound. Probably the nicest station in the system, but it was built by them and their design, and really, this really created a transparency in the design process. Because many times, we have meetings about a design or a project, and we write down in our post-it notes what we want, and then somebody comes back a month later with this idea for design. And people start to wonder, well, how did the design get there? But this way, when people build this model, they could see this transparency in the design process from start to finish. I wanted this, and there it is. So yeah, so this is a really beautiful station, and it broke right now it's a new station, but now it gives people, it doesn't make them proud because now what you did, you kind of created self-determination amongst the planning process. And for me, as a minority from East Los Angeles, to me, self-determination is critical because, far too often we get planned, we're part of planning processes, but, the planners always have the solutions. But when you share in the solutions to the problem, you create advocates of self-determination within the community group. So you're not creating just a document, but you're creating a path forward to change the environment that people are part of, and they can do it tomorrow. Because far too often, planning is really kind of at upper level. So now, this station gives people independence, you know, they didn't have before. Because now they don't have to take a taxi there, or, you know, whatever they need to how to get there. But it was really big breakthrough for them. Next.
And then the final project we're going to talk about is a plaza prototyping planning advocacy training that we did with Habitat for Humanity of Greater Los Angeles. So in the winter of 2021, we were approached by Habitat for Humanity of Greater Los Angeles to create a series of engagement events for the residents of a lower income neighborhood in North Long Beach. What was going on is that the city had actually just updated their general plan, and then they were working on specific plans for the various neighborhoods of the city. And Habitat has actually started moving into urban planning, especially in places like Los Angeles, where there's just not a lot of buildable vacant land anymore. So the traditional model that they've used of, you know, engaging people in building houses has gotten a lot more difficult just because there isn't that available land to do that on. So what they have moved into is creating programming for empowering people to be their own urban planners, essentially. So that's why they brought us in, and they wanted to equip the residents with the tools to be able to engage with these specific plan updates in a way that was productive, but in a way that they could also infuse their values and their creative ideas into the process. So we were up to the task at, you know, specific plans and general plans and all that. It's very complicated and kind of wonky and jargony. So the objective throughout all of this was to make it user friendly, to make it simple, easy to understand, and always to make it based on working with your hands and working through your senses. So we did this all online, actually, and so we translated all of our methods into an online format. So what we did, for example, so we do these sensory-based site explorations and walking tours, and in this case, we actually created a virtual version of this. So we had people go out to their favorite spaces and places in the neighborhood, and they filmed themselves talking about why they love this place. So this is a participant, actually a former staffer from Habitat we worked with, and she loves the sidewalk because it's super wide. She sees tons of people when she's walking or running, and everyone says hello to each other on the sidewalk. So here she is filming herself, telling us why she liked it. And then what we did is we spliced these all together into a virtual walking tour. So we gathered online, we watched all the different videos that people watched, essentially going on a tour. And then afterwards, we did a model building exercise where people built their ideal Washington neighborhood with found objects that they found in their houses, homes, apartments, dorms, you name it. And then we also trained them in advocacy, and this is something we've been wanting to do for a long time. I think this is just true for anyone. It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is. Engaging with planning, affecting change through planning can be really complicated. It can be really daunting. You know, people want to widen a sidewalk, say, in their neighborhood, or they want to get some traffic calming put in. It's very difficult to figure out how to do that. So we wanted to teach them about all the different ways that you can advocate for your creative ideas. So we came up with this concept of planning avenues for change, and we did a training on how you can engage through these different avenues to make your planning ideas become reality and advocate for them. And one of the biggest things, I'm not going to go through this list, but one of the biggest things that we wanted to convey is that we by default think, well, if we're going to affect change in planning, advocate for our ideas, we go to the planning department. But that's a lot of times not the most strategic place to go. Planners in and of themselves don't have a lot of power. They're very constrained by bureaucracy, by protocol, by policy. So we tried to expand their thinking so that they could see that there are all these other avenues that you can take for affecting change. So like the Office of Sustainability, the council office, existing nonprofits that you could partner up with, and then just everyday things that you can do as a resident with other neighbors in your community. So through the engagement events we did with them, one really strong recurring theme emerged, and that was that they wanted plazas. They wanted places to actually gather in. They didn't want to just have streets and sidewalks. They wanted public squares. And so one of the exercises we did was we had them design a plaza. And so these are different models that they built. A couple of folks actually merged drawing with model building. And we also, over the course of this, picked a potential real site for a plaza. And then what we did is we applied for a grant to fund a plaza prototyping event where the residents could actually use life-size objects. So we had trees donated from the city for the day. We had tables, chairs, benches, different kinds of seating, rugs, all the stuff you can see in here. And then people could actually test out their ideas in real time and space for the design of this plaza. So this is me with Marco, who was one of the participants in the online workshops, and he came to the event, and so we're just designing a little portion of the plaza together based on his ideas and what he wanted to see in the plaza. And we also got to mock up different bike ped connections to the plaza space. So that's what you can see here in the photos. We documented the process, and then we actually trained the residents, those who had been a part of the series of workshops before. We trained them in leading their own workshops. So this is Maria. She was one of the participants, and she actually started to lead her own model building workshops with her neighbors. And so this is the really key thing here, is that now these residents, they have not only the planning and design tools, but they have the advocacy tools for making their dreams, their visions, all the different ideas they have come to life in the neighborhood. And that's really important to us because we can't stay in a community or in a neighborhood forever. Obviously, we're going to have to leave at some point. But if we can build everyone's capacity and equip them with the tools to be able to do this on their own, then they can run with both the engagement methods and then also the tools for advocacy and change. So we want to talk about outcomes here. So a lot of times this is actually covered quite a bit in the book. So there's a long portion on outcomes because people will ask us all the time from the beginning until now, okay, well, this is great, you do these model building exercises, but how do those actually lead to plans, designs, and drawings? So to the right is actually a plan, design, drawing document that was generated out of a year-long series of engagement events we did in South Colton, and that's actually the core of the central part of the book, or the middle part of the book is really telling the story of this project that we did and the story of this community we worked with. So yes, the methods can lead to these very kind of typical planning documents, plans, designs, drawings, zone changes. And so the book explores this. But it also looks at how the methods we used unearthed information about the neighborhood and creative ideas that wouldn't have emerged otherwise. And I put this photo in because this is an example of the kinds of information that we actually discovered as we were doing the work. So this is a resident who has really adorned their public space, the parkway, with playground equipment, with benches, with trees, and then they've put these hoops over the sidewalks with lights. To a lot of planners, and if you're a code enforcement officer, you would look at this and be horrified. You think, oh my God, this is like non-compliance, this is horrible. But this is an example of the kind of really DIY urbanism, DIY retrofitting of these spaces and places in this neighborhood that the residents have done themselves because they've needed to, because the public realm is so degraded around here and the neighborhood has been so neglected by the city for so long that they've really taken things into their own hands. So we talk about this in the book, but this DIY urbanism and what would typically be called like, non-compliant, this would be like a big code violation. We took this as a real strength of the community and folded this into the ultimate plan. And so it was as much a chance for us to learn from the residents and how they've transformed the public realm as it was for us to offer up our ideas for how to make the neighborhood a better place. Anyway, so those are some tangible outcomes that we talk about in the book, and in response to the question we get, can this lead to plans, designs, and drawings? But then there are these really valuable intangible outcomes, and I just wanted to talk about these and mention them. We won't go in depth into them now, but there are a lot of things that come out of this process that are just as important as the tangible outcome. So in this case, with this photo here, we got folks who had been screaming at each other together at tables, building together and coming up with creative ideas together. And that's a really, really valuable outcome. It's not something, that you can translate into, something very physical, but it's something that has just as much importance, because that actually sets the tone and creates a space in which a real creative, forward-thinking redesign of the underpass can take place. And so the book really explores this more in depth. What are these intangibles? Can they be measured? Are there ways of measuring them? Do you always need to measure them? Anyways, so we're going to leave that there, and we're going to open up the questions. But again, if you want to buy the book, this is the discount code here. So SMART, all caps, and then you can just go to the Island Press website and purchase it there. These are, and these will be up again later, but this is our contact info if you want to get in touch with us. So James's email, the Place It website, his Twitter and Instagram handles, and then my email website and my Twitter and Instagram handles. And yeah, we'll turn it back over to you guys and start the Q&A. So thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, John. And we'll have John and James turn on their camera here, since they are together today in the same space. Simplifies it a little bit for us. And thank you all for submitting many questions here, and you can continue to submit questions. We'll go to at least 2:30 Eastern, I guess 11:30 Pacific, since they're in California today. And we'll just keep going. Many excellent questions, I'll say, that have come in. Also some comments that we'll go through as well. And I'll just kind of start, I guess, chronologically earlier in the presentation when you were talking about some of the setup for the discussion today. So the first question is from Cheryl Gross Glazier, who asks, how can we actually include all of the people who have opinions, but whose circumstances do not allow for showing up at a meeting or event? I am thinking of people who work on non-traditional hours, people who are older or who have small children, or people with disabilities, or who do not have what they perceive to be a good mode of transportation for getting to an event or meeting. How do you include them in your process?
Well, what we do, we go to them usually. So we found that, that we partner with local groups that know these communities, and we usually go to a farmer's market to capture the mother with their kids. Or we'll go to the senior center at lunchtime to capture the seniors that get meals there. Or we'll go to a school at 8 o'clock in the morning where Latinas drop off their kids at school and work with them there. So I think our method is very flexible, and that's the beauty of it. We can go and work in different locations and kind of really find these places where people gather. And for disability, you go to the disability center. So there's a lot of different venues there. It's not a lot of overhead and PowerPoints and maps. Just going out there and just kind of start and play. We can go to parks or in front of stores or buy the groceries. So it's really a flexible method that really can be applied to many different places.
Yeah, we go into this more. We'll go more in depth into this in the book. But so we have different methods that we use. We've got the model building workshop, which is a sit-down workshop, so people would take time out of their days to go to that. We also do pop-up models. These are models that, like James was saying, we take the model to a place where people are already going to be. So in the case of South Colton, the project that we talk about pretty extensively in the book, we went to the only market in the neighborhood where that still exists. So there used to be tons of markets in the neighborhood. Now there's only one. We went to that market, so people are going to be going there already. They can stop at the pop-up model. They can build their ideas in 3 minutes. It can be really quick. We document them by way of photos, and we write down their ideas on a post-it note. And then we have that as a record. Here's this creative idea that this person came up with, or this kid came up with, family came up with. And then they move on, and then more people come in and they build more, and so on and so forth. So that is precisely why we did that, because then people don't have to take time out of their busy days to go to a meeting. But we like to do both, so you capture different audiences, and then you can capture a broader swath of information in the process.
Great, thanks, John. Next question here is from Gabby Danbeck, who says, I just got the book and I'm very excited to read it. We do some similar activities to these with Legos. Is there a benefit to a more random assortment of crafting materials?
Yes.
All right, I'll start, because I think the problem with Legos is that Legos are already pre-prescribed, and people think about the form of the Lego, like you can only go certain up or down or sideways, and you have all these colors and you have all this form you deal with. So people are really interested about the form, but we have random objects like hair rollers, popsicle sticks, artificial flowers. They really capture people's brain, what people think about space in their brain, the kind of messiness about your everyday activities, about what your brain thinks about space. And it really forces people to be creative and think out of the box. Because a lot of times people have biases about Legos, that only boys play with Legos. And I've heard stories where my brother played with Legos and I couldn't, so therefore I don't like Legos. But this way you have this kind of open forum, we can just like dump all their ideas. So if a person wants to just play with flowers and build a city out of flowers, and they like flowers, go right ahead. Because we really want to encourage people to be as creative as possible, and also want them to think out of the box by giving them a hair roller that can be interpreted 5 different ways. If I give everybody cars and houses, they'd build suburbia again and again and again. But having them think differently about forms and spaces with these objects, really tap into their senses and what places feel like. So for me, it's just important to capture the essence or feeling of a place than it is to capture how the place should actually be. Because for the feelings, to the planners, you want to know a place, but for the community, it's about a place feels. And sometimes that feeling of a space isn't not something you can build and form, it's just how you experience it. Maybe it's flowers, shade, trees, or noise sounds, noise.
The other thing I was going to say about Legos as well, I mean, we're not anti-Lego. I mean, that's not, I think that the point that we're trying to make and what we've seen through this work that we've done with Legos in particular is that it makes people think of buildings. And so they think of planning and communities as they're really constrained because suddenly it's all about buildings. And then the individual Legos themselves, they come across as like a story, right? So I'm going to make a 3-story building. I'm going to make a 4-story building. And that really restricts how people can think about not just their communities now, but their communities in the future. It can stir up a lot of things, a lot of fear in people, because then it stirs up things about like, oh, I don't like density, I don't want more housing, and so on and so forth. So if you can use found objects, it really frees people from thinking about forcing them to think about cities only as buildings and as concrete and this really hard infrastructure. So we're really trying to get people to move away from that, because like James was saying, that's not really how we experience a city. I mean, that is part of our experience of a city, but our city experience is also made up of memory, and aspiration and imagination, and nature, and all these kind of amorphous things that a medium like Legos really can't capture. Anyways.
Yeah, and I think also of all the Don's workshops we've done, people always focus on that public realm, and buildings are always very secondary. So here's my community garden, here's my street with the vendor on it, and here's my tree, and here's my park, and here's my my kindergarten, and then here are the buildings on the side. So so the public realm becomes a really critical part. That's how people want to see their communities as a place of engagement in that space. So we need tools for them to articulate what that space should actually feel like. And I think Lego just kind of doesn't really have those kind of tools to do it, but maybe they will eventually. But at this point, they don't. So I think hair rollers and different things like that makes people one thing also feel comfortable with this exploration because they know these shapes and forms, household objects. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So we got a few questions kind of related, asking sort of in addition to the book, are there any sources on the web or elsewhere about finding sources for these materials or types of materials to use in the meetings? Like a little bit more about it. Okay, we like this approach. Where do we find this stuff?
You mean where you find the model building materials? Or?
Correct. Yeah, that kind of thing.
Well, the materials can be anything. So and we do this like when we do these online. We usually give people photos of past models so they can see what they can use to build. But like you could use pens, you could use like headphones, headsets, earbuds, you name it. You can collect whatever objects you really want to use, and then just have you just assemble them together into a kit, and then you just have them. So James is like he's like a master collector, so he's always kind of scouting for these kinds of things. So he'll also pick up like a bottle cap and he'll be like, okay, this can be part of our model building kit. So I think that's what you have to do. So you could go out and like buy stuff, and so things that we use a lot that you could potentially buy would be like pipe cleaners are great, hair rollers. Basically every playset kit has hair rollers in it. What are some other things?
Buttons, beads, yarn, feathers. I think the whole idea is to really have a kit of parts that kind of captures every scale, for big things to small things. So people actually pick small beads as their model, and have a tiny scale, or they'll pick big objects, and you also want to capture colors. Like colors are really popular. Like yellow might mean the sun or warmth. Green might mean a tree, or blue might mean the water. So colors are important. Also textures, how things feel. People might like a fuzzy feeling for something. Some want to look at yarn, or it might want to have things that are kind of blingy, shiny, which are Mardi Gras beads. People love those too. So just have an assortment of good objects that really kind of provoke people in thinking about their senses. We want them to really kind of dig in, really help them stimulate their imaginations. See them in this big mess and kind of create energy, so they're searching for things, and they kind of like really quickly can start to generate ideas.
Okay, thank you. Our next question here is from Jonathan Morales, who's asking, can you explain or talk more about the process for implementing the results of these workshops? Like, how do you turn the creative ideas from the participants into new policies or initiatives?
Yeah, I mean, so we go really in depth into that in the book. But at the end of the day, in some ways, it's no different from a conventional method of engagement. You're still generating information, you're still generating ideas. But in our case, what we end up doing, I think there are a couple things that are going to be very different that emerge that then are going to inform plans, designs, drawings, and so forth. So one, you're going to get really creative ideas that are forward thinking and that aren't just based on what people actually know already. Two, you're going to get a set of core values. And if it's just the core values that you get, that's way more than you would get from a conventional approach to community engagement. So you're going to get substantive shared core values that people have in these communities, and then those can inform and set the tone for the overall planning process. So we did a model building workshop very early on with the community we talk about in the book. And that generated a set of core values which could then guide the overall process from start to finish. So for example, a theme that emerged, a strong theme that emerged very early on was trees. People kept talking about trees, they wanted more trees. And so that then set the tone for something that we were gonna look for as we went through the overall planning process. Are there ways that the zoning could be changed to make it more possible to have more trees? Do we need to be working with public works? What are the reasons why there aren't enough trees in the neighborhood already? So those are the kinds of things that can really shape and guide the planning process in a way that's really meaningful, and that's where the process is informed by the values of the community. And then at the end of the process, people in the community see those values reflected in the overall plans, designs, and drawings. So we did things like market analysis. We proposed zone changes at the end. We had street sections, all sorts of things. And these are all in the book. And those are all things that emerged from this. But they were always guided by these core values and these recurring themes that came out of the engagement methods that we use.
Yeah, I think for us, what's really important is that we want to teach people how to articulate their relationship with the built environment. And I think math and data doesn't do that. So a lot of our clients are women because they can articulate when they walk down the street, it feels like this, but I wanted this. And this is how it's going to feel like this with trees and flowers and plants. It's how people can start to articulate their, like how that built environment actually connects to their physical. Planners might get the land use right, but the feeling wrong. For example, Los Angeles Unified School District built a series of schools in LA in the 90s, but all the schools, so again, that's a shortfall of planning. Because we don't have any tools to really understand feeling and emotion in these spaces. And plus, we want people to have a long-term understanding of planning, so they come back again and again and again, and they can, you're covering their values and their stories, and they realize that their story, is part of a plan, and that plan becomes their plan. So now they know why planning, especially for Latinos, they know why planning is important to them, because it's about telling their story and making the city work for you. And plus people are learning from each other. So you want to build this kind of social cohesion in communities. They might never trust government, but at least they'll trust themselves to work together. And I think that's the fundamental part of our democracy, people working together and trusting each other. And this is the way to do that.
Great, thank you. So the next question, I think, refers to the first example that you cited. And the question is, why were the prior public meetings so contentious in that process? And did you have to adjust your process at all to account for that? Or did you just kind of follow what you usually do and the contentiousness just melted away by the way you did your participation?
Well, so the meetings have been contentious because basically people were taking their charged emotions from the space itself. So like, just a little background, so a lot of the younger users of the space, they said they were getting cussed out basically by people walking in the space, and older users of the space. And then the older users of the space felt kind of, well, no, they felt like kind of maybe sort of assaulted by the sense, in a sensory way, by the speed of people on bikes going through, and so it just made them feel really uncomfortable. So those charged emotions would be brought to these public meetings, and people are already emotionally charged when they go to public meetings, and then the fact that you're engaging people through talking means that, going back to what we were talking about earlier in the presentation, it means that people are not going to be their best selves. I mean, they're going to be their selfish selves. They're going to dig their heels in. They're not going to want to entertain new ideas, no matter what side of the equation you're on. So it didn't surprise us that that had been the dynamic because, again, you know, when you gauge people through talking in these public meeting settings, that's the kind of dynamic that emerges.
Yeah, I think also in that situation, you had it's near Stanford, so you had these kind of older men or older people that thought that think they're the pillars of the community. You know, they know everything and I have the solution. And therefore, you must you drink my Kool-Aid. And for us, planning is about collaboration. There is no right or wrong answer in the planning process. But these people, you know, these long-term residents think that they control, you know, they have this privilege over the community. So people, so minorities feel very much disempowered to go against them. Well, I've only been here a year, so what can I do or say to challenge them?
Or young people.
Young people.
Young people.
Young people. So I think for us, we want to break that. We want to break that stronghold people have in the planning process in these community meetings, because like you say, you know, you talk to any planner and they know exactly who's meeting and what they're going to say over and over and over again. So people like me that are minorities, we're not going to challenge them because we feel very disempowered. Well, they must know because they've been here for 100 years or, you know, for 20 years. So for us, it's a way of really disempowering these you know, these forces, you know, these players and make them kind of be all at the same level and collaborate together and learn from each other rather than telling people have the right answer.
Well, okay, so yeah, and I would add, so the second part of your question about, you know, whether we change the methods that we use based on what the dynamic had been. Yes, I mean, so we still use the model building exercise, the model building workshop. We use that with them. But the format that we use, where we had the younger users of the space in one group on one day, and then the older users of the space in one group on another day, that was something that we very much came up with in conversation with the folks from the city and then the folks from Alta Plan. You know, this just makes sense given the contentious nature of the project. The folks that James is referring to, these kind of pillars of knowledge of the community, like they're a part of the community too, but what our objective is to level the playing field. So it's not so much that we disempower people, it's that we're trying to allow everyone to be at the same level so that no one person can dominate the conversation. So in the case of the workshop that we did with older residents of the space who were very much these kind of pillars of knowledge of the community, what we had to do is kind of coax them into this model building exercise because they were ready to just talk. Like they came to the meeting kind of expecting it to be a regular meeting where everyone just like says what they think. And we weren't going to do that. So there was a little bit of, and it was very on the fly. We didn't really plan it. And honestly, like in retrospect, I don't remember exactly point by point how we did it, but we managed to get everyone to build, to just not talk and just to build. And it worked out incredibly well. So we had those guys building their first models of their first memories of a mobility experience, and they were great. The memories were great, and then we had them work together and build a shared bike ped space, models of a shared bike ped space, which they did. So kind of going back to what I was saying in the presentation, the whole objective of what we're doing, or one of the objectives of what we're is to embed equity and these kinds of things into the process so that by using this process, you kind of by default level the playing field. So you don't have to tell people, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do this, you must say this. That's not what we do. It's the process itself, and then it's sort of making people feel comfortable enough to participate in the process. So creating this physical and kind of figurative space in which people can feel comfortable to work with their hands and build. Because, you know, a lot of people older, for people who are older, like we don't usually, a lot of us don't work with our hands a lot. We don't build models, we don't play. So there is a little bit of this kind of entry into the process that you have to do and make everyone feel comfortable, no matter who they are.
Yeah, and for us, you know, everybody at least says something. They tell us about their favorite child memory. And for an immigrant, that's a big step in being civic in the U.S. because, you know, they come to these spaces where they don't know anybody, they've only been here 1 year, and they get to tell their story, and they get to hear everybody else's story. So now they're in the process, and now everybody can learn from each other, and you create that equal playing field.
Okay, thanks, James. So actually, John, you just kind of teed up the next question here from Lena Walker, who said, what you said about embedding equity into the process rather than outlining it explicitly with language really resonated with me and my experiences with community engagement. Do you ever have reflections or conversations at the end of the process to tie the embedded equity concepts back to more an explicit conversation, a sort of food for thought? And do you see people making those connections on their own as discussions take place throughout the process?
Yeah, well, so what we do at the end of the workshops, and we go more in depth into this in the book, is what we're really trying to do is, yes, like what you said, allow for a reflection that is going to continue after people leave the event. So we don't want it to be like, okay, that was a fun model building exercise later, right? And so what we try to do, and it's not so much equity per se and specifically that we're going to talk about at the end, but it's more so having people start to make connections between the experience that they've had in the workshop or in the sensory-based site exploration or the pop-up, how they make connections and their lives, their everyday lives. So we ask questions to get people to start making those connections and get people to start thinking about how this to be relevant to their lives, how it could be relevant to their surroundings, to their work. Could they see integrating this process into something in their workplace or with their neighbors, so that then there's a life to the workshop after the workshop ends. So that's really how we do it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to add anything.
And also, I think it's really, okay, when we ask people to build a favorite child memory, it's a time for them to reflect, but also put a value on experience in place. For example, working in Santa Monica and Pittsburgh, two African American women, they talked about doing hair with their elders as being their safe space as a child. So that memory, that safe space, now in the future, tells you that people from communities different ways. And for the case of Santa Monica, they wanted to see the beauty supply stores come back to the streets, because that's how they create a community, and you see the value in it. I might not see value in the beauty supply store, but for these women, because their child memories was so important around hair, that adds value. And I think so. We want to cover these stories in places that people put values on, and how do you uplift these values into the future city, so people can feel like they belong there. And I think a lot of times we forget about that. We think, well, I don't go there, therefore it doesn't really apply to me. But I think we want to create these kind of places that have value to people.
The other thing too is to add is that the dynamic in the room when we do these workshops, if you can somehow measure the dynamic between and the very end, is very different in a very positive way. So you start, and this could be true even for like coworkers. So if we were to do, and we do this sometimes, we'll do a workshop for people who work together for a really long time. The exercises unearth and uncover, kind of like James was saying, all this information and these ideas, experience, and these values, these experiences that are shared in a lot of ways. And so people start to see the humanity in other people in a way that maybe they hadn't before, or they just learn things about people they've known for a long time that they hadn't known before, and those things have real value to them. But they're also things that resonate with other people because people see like, oh, actually that's very similar to a childhood memory that I had, or there are elements of this that are very similar to a childhood memory that I had. So it can create a kind of cohesion. It can build bridges. It can cut down on polarization, polarity, all these things that are really important for equity outcomes. So you suddenly can have a cohesive group that can then work together after the workshop on various issues in the neighborhood or community or city
Yeah, in fact, one time we did a workshop, and this African built a beach in Africa where he played soccer, and this Latino guy in LA built a beach where he played soccer. He had these two different experiences, two different cultures going to the same place and talking about the same experience. So you see the bridges between people and these connecting between people, and you're starting planning from human experiences rather than infrastructure. Because I think a lot of planners, we start planning with infrastructure. When we tell planners, you start with infrastructure, you're not going to get far because people are going to shut you down. But you start these new experiences and these stories, people not think together, plan together, and kind of build a that can connect these stories together.
Okay, thank you. And again, thanks to everybody who submitted these excellent questions. If we don't get to them all, we'll definitely share them with the speakers today. So we got several questions around the area of understanding that this seems like a great idea for site-specific projects, but do you have examples about where the hands-on approach was used for county-wide, regional planning, or comprehensive plans?
Totally. Yeah, I mean, so we actually just finished up a round of workshops with the with LA County and their update of their specific plans for the central area of LA County. And you know, I'm trying to think about what I can tell you that will be helpful. So in terms of like how they worked, I mean, we held a series of 6 workshops. We did them all online. We had people build their favorite childhood memory, and then we had them build their ideal neighborhood. And so we did 6 workshops in 6 different parts of LA County. And then we gathered all that information. We documented it by way of the models that people built, by way of the core values that emerged, by way of the creative ideas. And then those we then transformed into a document and conversation that we had with the prime contractor to then weave that into the next phase of the planning work that they were doing. I think one of the most striking things that the planners noticed is that people were so positive. The residents were so positive. So that if I don't, you know, I can't see who's on this call. I'm guessing there are a lot of urban planners on the call. We know the experience of being at a community meeting and getting yelled at. Someone tweeted something, I think it was for this event or for the next one, where it was Leslie Knope, you know, from Parks and Rec, saying, when people are yelling at me, they're carrying loudly at me. So, you know, we all have the experience of being carried loudly at. So we know that, but the planners were like, I can't believe how positive people were. People didn't yell, people weren't mad. They came up with all these creative ideas. They had like aspirations, and they shared those aspirations. Now, people did talk about problems in their neighborhoods, so that is real. That is legitimate. I mean, there are problems that people are facing, but the way we formatted it, instead of having this forum at the beginning where people talked about problems, we did the modeling exercises first. We did all the aspirational stuff, all the positive stuff first, and then we left time at the end. If there were outstanding things that people wanted to talk about, they could talk about them. Depending on the part of the county we were in, you know, so that portion of the meeting might have been like 5 minutes, or it might have been 20 minutes. It really just depended. But in that way, we at least got to capture all of the aspirations and the core values of the community before we moved on to these things that people are really frustrated about, and for, you know, for real legitimate reasons they were frustrated about. So, you know, things like illegal dumping and people, you know, masses of like campers and RVs parked in their streets. And then they're asking, you know, why are all the RVs on our streets, but they're not on the streets in the more well-to-do neighborhoods? I mean, these are really legitimate concerns, but at least we were able to get to the aspirations, the core values, the creative ideas first before we got to those.
Yeah, I think a lot of our workshops we do are really kind of conceptual, kind of topical. For instance, I'll do workshops with all women and ask them, how would you create a safe street for you to walk on at night? Or, you know, or how would you create a gender-friendly city? Or it could be in health. How would you create a healthy city? You know, and I think, you know, at planning, we have all these terms like sustainability, health, But how does that translate to actually urban form? So this is a good way to really help people think about health and urban form together. We have all these policies, so for women and gender, they can actually build a street that makes them feel comfortable, and they have evidence what that looks like and can present it. So I think a lot of our work is really kind of topical, based on what people on these kind of topics, and then it could go into the specific. Okay, now you have all these ideas about safe streets for women in Oakland. Now, where would you actually apply that in downtown Oakland or something, or downtown Los Angeles? But start with the topical and the brainstorming, how people think big. Because if you bring on a map, people are going to start to focus on the site and say, well, there's a gas station here at this corner, therefore we can't put a light rail line there because there's a gas station there. But having no gas station at all, no map, people are just free to think, or free to think different ways. So just a really kind of more of a brainstorming of ideas, and then but you want to hear all these ideas because you want to put all the ideas on the table and see what works and what doesn't work. But helping people transform, helping people understand what does health mean to a community. I did a workshop one time in the Bronx, on the Bronx River. Went to the laundromat to do workshops, but all the people at the laundromats were immigrants from the Caribbean. They had no clue about the Bronx River, where it was at, what it looked like, but they know rivers from the Caribbean, or places like the Caribbean or Latin America, with palm trees and turtles and sand. So you're thinking, people think differently, even though people think about river being a certain way, people might have a different idea what that is. So it's important for us to really understand how people think about our language even.
The other thing I was going to add to, in response to your question about, doing something that's not just based on a site, but on something that's bigger, we talk about this more in the book. But the sensory-based site exploration is also a sensory-based walking tour. So we do that exercise with people in a discrete site, so like a vacant lot or California bike ped underpass. But we also do it on a neighborhood scale. So with the neighborhood that we talk about extensively in the book, South Colton, we did a sensory-based tour of the neighborhoods so that we could capture a broad swath of sensory-based information, memory-based information that we could then fold into what became this overlay for a whole neighborhood. So it wasn't just for like one parcel in this neighborhood. It was looking at the neighborhood as a whole and how we could make the neighborhood greener, more walkable, more inviting, all the things that the residents wanted.
Yeah, we just did one also in Oakland, or East Bay, on 63rd Street, that runs from the hills to the bay, and it goes through Emeryville, Oakland, and Berkeley. And how do people, instead of talking about the history of the site, they have having explore with their body to figure out how they experience the street and how to make it better. And that was really exciting, understanding how people thought about sun and light and all the different kind of the intangibles that we really can't measure on a map.
Yeah, and then after that, we followed it up with a model building exercise. Then everyone built models of a redesigned 63rd Street. So it could be for a corridor, it could be for a little parcel, it could be for a neighborhood. It really just depends, and we just vary everything in our approaches based on what the scale of the project is.
Great, thank you. Our next question here is from Amanda Knight, who says, due to the pandemic, a lot of community engagement efforts have been restricted to a digital platform or the virtual world. Do you have any tips and tricks for creating a more hands-on experience for participants through online engagement when in-person engagement isn't an option?
Yeah, so what we did with our workshops is we just, instead of us providing found objects to people for building models, people just use objects from around their houses, apartments, dorms, you name it. And they use those materials to then build their models. And then they take pictures of them and share them, send them to us, and we just screen share them, or they can use their cameras and just show us what they built. Giving people the option, if they want to draw, they can draw as well, or they can do drawing and model building. And then, like we talked about in the presentation, like we did the virtual walking tour. So we gave people the opportunity to participate in a walking tour, contribute to a walking tour, and also participate in it, but in a virtual format. And if people want to see the results of that walking tour, the virtual walking tour, you can go to the Prairie Forum YouTube channel, and we have that up so you can see what the residents actually produced for the virtual walking tour. If you want to add anything.
Yeah, so I think so we switched over to online probably a year and a half ago, and it's been really exciting, really different, because it becomes more of a scavenger hunt for people in their homes, and it's kind of like a show and tell, because now they look for objects in their homes that convey a memory. And people pull out like a baby blanket from 30 years ago. You pull out a rock or seashell, a picture of their favorite pet, and talk about these things. Where when we provide the workshop objects, we don't have that kind of stuff, but these are homes that have that stuff. So they look for it and they show it to everybody. They tell a story about it, and you realize that people realize that their safe space at home is surrounded by objects that kind of convey a meaning. So how can we translate our cities into these kind of spaces, and what it means to really create enduring space with memory and and objects. So I really kind of had a different kind of connotation. Plus, what's interesting too is that you can hold virtual workshops in the community, but you can also do them nationally. I've done workshops online with Latinos, from New York, Texas, Boston, California, on the topic. So now you're trying to create a space of inquiry on a topic that everybody could kind of chime into and share their story on a natural level. You can't do it physically. So it has kind of pros and cons, but it gets people really thinking about space. And plus, people tend to talk more, through Zoom because they're in their safe space. So where in a public meeting, they just say their 2 minute or 1 minute and then kind of sit down. But here they kind of get a little more, to get deeper into discussions.
Okay, thank you. Next question here is from Sandra Nunez Courier, who asks, how do you deal with the public who does not want to participate in a creative activity? And how do you promote or introduce this method?
Yeah.
Well, I think, for one thing, when we do the outreach, you always have a picture of the workshop. And basically, it's like going to a party and not talking to people. After a while, they break down. I think all the workshops I've done, only 2 people have walked out of the room. They see the objects and say, well, I can't do this. This is not planning. They walk away. And that's something, or else, or else people will not, like older, will not, don't like to collaborate. So they have a hard time. But I think, but that's a really low percentage of people that we worked with over the years. So yeah, just like going to a party and not talking to people. So it becomes very social and very fun really quickly, and people just engage because everybody else is being engaged.
I think the other thing too about that is so the nature of the work is different. Like I said, people who, as we get older, we tend to play less and work with our hands less. So there is a little bit of a kind of entry into the process that needs to happen, and that can happen actually well before the workshop itself. So having some trusted people in the community who are on board with this method, who can be kind of champions for the method, or can prep people or tell them in advance, like, here's what we'll be doing. Then having things like what James is saying, if you have photos of the hands-on activity in the flyers that you're using, so that people know when they look at it that it's going to be different. The plus and added benefit of that too are going to have, they're going to know that it's not just going to be a typical meeting where they sit and they listen to a presentation and then they ask questions, or they have like their 2 minutes to talk. People are really excited by that, especially in the day and age of Zoom. They're really just sick of it. Like they don't want to do that. So they have some sense that this is going to be a different method.
Yeah, and usually,
Okay, just finish. And then with the activity itself, and we talk about this more in the book, but because it's play and because you're working with your hands, like people have to feel comfortable. And so what we tend to do is the meetings just need to be a little bit, you have to have a period at the front that's just a little bit longer. That's not so like cut to the chase. You know, there's this kind of typical planning way of doing things, or get here at 5 o'clock, the presentation is going to go at 5, you're going to have questions, you're going to be able to ask questions at 5:45, and then everyone's going to go home. This doesn't give people the opportunity mentally, physically, to just sort of sink into the experience. You have to have that up front that's kind of unprogrammed, that's a little bit looser, where people just, have some snacks, talk to their neighbors, so on and so forth, so that people can start to feel comfortable enough so then they'll be able to work with their hands. In the case where we have someone who's really stubborn about it, like James is saying, it doesn't happen very often, but like in the case of Palo Alto, we had the older guys who were kind of these pillars of knowledge in the community, and they just wanted to come in and just talk. And like I was saying, I couldn't remember the exact details. I think part of what we did is we actually helped them at first to build, right? So why don't you do this? Like, let's try this. Why don't you do that? It sounds kind of like patronizing or like in a certain sort of way, but it worked. I think it was just, that was the way that we were able to get participants to feel comfortable enough to play essentially and work with their hands and do something they probably haven't done in a long time. And that's really important. I think you have to approach all of this with a sense of empathy. It doesn't matter who the person is. So yes, these might have been people who had dominated the meetings up until this point, but we're not going to approach them with this kind of like, you're terrible people, now we're going to put you in your place. Like, that's not what we're trying to do. Everyone has the capacity to be designers, planners. They have their own creative ideas, and we are there to help bring those things out of people, no matter who it is.
Thanks, John. So we're getting close to the end of the hour, so we'll ask a few more questions. And again, thanks to everybody for submitting these questions. We've taken the contact information off the screen temporarily so that you could see our speakers since they're sitting together. We'll put that back up in a few minutes. So if you want to contact them directly, you can do so. Next question here is from Gregory Wright, who asks, do you see a role for using augmented reality or mixed reality in the public environment in a sensory-based way, maybe in a two-stage manner, in which a number of design ideas previously created in a workshop are then in the walking tour seen as an overlay in the public space that's being designed or redesigned?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. We're very low tech people. Yeah. A lot of what we do is, I think that's at the core of what we do is stuff that's low tech, and materials are cheap, and we don't fuss with a lot of technology. But that being said, I don't want to shoot down your idea. I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe there could be some sort of hybrid sensory-based walking tour where we did the more traditional-based thing, but then there might be opportunities along the way to see what that space and place would look like based on, preliminary designs and drawings and all the core values and things that have come out of the previous workshop. So I think that's an interesting idea. We could talk more about it. It's also something that you could, run with.
Talk to us about.
Talk to us about, yeah, because it's not like we're Luddites, of course here we are on a computer, we're using this webinar function and so forth, but I think it's just this recurring theme of accessibility for the work we do. We're trying to make it as accessible to as broad an audience as possible, and a lot of times what that means is doing something that's kind of low tech in terms of the materials we use at the end of the day. Yeah. So.
Okay, a couple more here. Next question is, how long is the workshop? It always seems to take 10 minutes for people to warm up and talk in a workshop. I imagine it would take about 30 minutes for people to finish their model.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we definitely go into like the nuts and bolts of that in the book about like how much time you should allot to each portion. You'd be surprised by how quickly people can build their models. So these, these aren't 2-scale models. They're not supposed to be perfect. People just sort of run with things, and so you get the idea is for people to have a flash, this sort of flash in their mind of here's my memory, and you capture all the different elements of it, and then you just run with it, right? Sometimes the memory is actually jogged by way of the materials, right? So people will go up to the table where we have those materials. So we did a workshop at Soka University in Southern California, and this one woman was from Ethiopia, and she saw all these yellow flowers, fake yellow flowers, and that triggered her memory about playing in these vacant fields and this certain time of year when all of these yellow flowers would bloom. So that's how. So you'd be surprised. It's a quick model build. It's like you can do. We in person will do like give people like 10 minutes tops, but you don't need to really give them more time. Now, when people work in teams to build their ideal space or place, we usually give them a bit more time because they're collaborating and they have to kind of hash things out, and the scale of the model is generally going to be bigger in terms of the area in question that they're building in response to, right? So they're building an ideal neighborhood, they're building an ideal community or something like that. So we'll give them more time. We don't like to do we don't like to do more than 2 hours tops. So it's like an hour and a half
tops.
An hour and a half is what we like to aim for. Online, it's generally a little bit shorter because people just don't want to be online for as long as they do in person. So we try to keep it to an hour. Sometimes we'll do an hour and a half. It really depends. But the hour and a half is really the core of it. And then we have time at the beginning and the end for just like setup and cleanup and taking everything down. So.
Yeah, and for classrooms, you do it for 50 minutes because the classroom has 50 minutes kind of intervals. So yeah, I think for us, it's really keeping them short and sweet. So we want 100% attention during this 1 hour plus. So we get a lot of more input than having a long drawn video where people get bored and start talking on their phone or looking at their text. Because people during this time don't really use their cell phones to text or anything. So it's really getting to be at 100% attention. For a lot of working class people, an hour plus is kind of all they have to offer, and we, they have time-wise, so we like to keep it short.
Okay, thank you. Next one here is, how do we take these collaborative outcomes and bring them to decision makers? And how can we embed this method in community planning, not just as an activity, but as a validating aspect for area plans and revitalizations?
I think you invite the decision makers to the workshops.
Yeah, at the beginning.
Yeah, we actually did one in Milwaukee, in Oregon, and sustainability, and the mayor was there. So the mayor heard directly from the constituents what people wanted. So it was on sustainability, and everybody talked about the river. So now that is part of this platform was the river for Milwaukee, Oregon. So the whole idea is to get the decision makers to go to the meetings and hear directly from the constituents what they want. Yeah, and then plus you have more ears at the meeting, so you can figure out what they can figure out what's being said here. So I think that's kind of the easiest and fun. And these people, the decision makers want to see the feedback. They want to see people actually engage in in this kind of process, so they feel a lot more secure in making decisions, and they can kind of go through it themselves.
Yeah, I think having these trusted community leaders from the get-go who are involved in the process, like James was saying, is really important. But then they can also be advocates for the community and for the process and the creative ideas later on in the process. So that was very much the case with South Colton, which is the project, really main project we talk about in the book. We really had that. We had an advocate who's embedded in the community, a local council member, And he was there from start to finish, you know, really advocating for both the process, but also for the residents' ideas that came out of the process from start to finish.
Yeah.
And then the second half of the question, I actually can't, I don't remember that one. I don't know how much time you have. I'm seeing it's 11:29, so.
Yeah, we're probably going to wrap up next, but if there's anything else you wanted to share before we go into the wrap up, please do.
I think that, yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty good. I think it's just the key is to have someone embedded in the community who can be an advocate, a council person, and have them involved from the beginning.
And it also shows them, it also shows them if they care and gives them the opportunity to care.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. So with that, actually, we will go ahead and wrap up. And I just wanted to give both of you an opportunity to kind of give us some closing thoughts before we do finish. So John, you may want to put their camera back on.
Okay. Share my webcam. Here we are. Yeah, so I think that one of the biggest things I wanted to say, just because we get this question all the time about, you know, how do you weave these methods into the creation of plans, designs, drawings, things that are regional in scale or things that are neighborhood at the neighborhood level. You know, this is something that you can very well do with this, and I hope that we've made it clearer by way of this presentation that that's possible. But also, while we're here, that we start to expand our concept of outcomes and really entertain and understand the value of the intangible outcomes that come out of this process, because they can be just as valuable as the nuts and bolts outcomes of the process. And the book really does go in depth in, you know, so both how you can weave this into a long range, larger scale project, but also how you can explore and examine the outcomes and look at both the tangibles and the intangibles. The final thing I'll say before I turn it over to James is we are going to be starting to do in-person workshops and book events, which is exciting. So we haven't done any yet just because of COVID, but our first one's going to be on March 5th, which is next Saturday, and that's going to be in the Bay Area in Berkeley, and then we're going to be doing one in Los Angeles in April at the Helms Bakery space, and then after that we're going to be up in Oregon and potentially in Washington doing in-person workshops and book events up there. So you can follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. You can find us on LinkedIn, and we always post details about these events. So if you're excited to come to an in-person event and you're on the West Coast, they will be coming up. And then we're going to be moving into the Midwest, I think, and then onto the East Coast, I think, later in the summer. So those details we're still kind of ironing those details out, but they're forthcoming.
And I'd like to add, I think as planners, just be experimental with your outreach. You know, and find your comfort zone in community engagement. You know, it can be a really beautiful tool to use, and it can be really helpful. Find where you're comfortable in this process. And, you know, so this is just a method that we use, but you can probably find more methods out there that you can engage with the community with.
Yeah, I think the key thing about the methods is make sure that you're always engaging people through their hands and senses and putting the talking aside. And that can then set the stage for really good outcomes and useful outcomes in the process.
Yeah, and become that artist out there for the city.
Yeah.
Great, thank you both. And again, your contact information is on the screen for folks who are interested in contacting you directly. We'll share the questions with them, and then also we'll be posting the recording and any handouts that we have on our archive page. So thank you both very much today. And with that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Dream, Play, Build, Hands-on Community Engagement for Enduring Spaces and Places. I'd like to offer a giant thank you to James Rojas and John Kamp for a great presentation. To everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who came off the sick bench today to help make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, All attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits outside of AICP. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your inbox for details on future webinars, including the comprehensive plan, sustainable, resilient, and equitable communities for the 21st century at 1 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, March 17th with two FAICPs, David Rouse and Rocky Piro. See you then. Thank you.